are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We've got a great presentation lined up for you today, but before we get started, there are just a few general admin points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please let us know using that same questions tool, and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, this session is being recorded and we'll be sharing a copy of that recording with you via email in the coming days. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to get us started.
Hello and good morning. Welcome to our session. This is the 3456th session for artificial intelligence for the IP department. But in all seriousness, we have an amazing panel lined up for you today. My name is Samir Rayani and I'm the CEO of Dalcera. We are a patent analytics and tools company. The format of today's session is that we will start with a brief overview of where AI is in 2022. We'll level up the room, so to speak, and then we will go into our group discussion. Thereafter, we'll open up the floor for your questions. So where are we with AI in 2022? Let's see. If I'm searching for an avocado chair and I get hundreds of results, that's AI. If I'm typing my email and Gmail suggests that I should add a please here, a thank you there, fix some grammatical errors, that's also AI. If I'm trying to talk to Siri while I'm driving the car and Siri doesn't understand my accent and shout to Siri, Siri shouts back, that's AI as well. But something amazing happened last month. Ilya Sutskever, he is the chief scientist of OpenAI, a very important AI company. He said on Twitter, it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. That set off a big uproar on Twitter. And of course, people said, no, we are not quite there. We are not in Will Smith's iRobot movie world or anything like that yet. But you can see where the discussion is heading. And that's pretty interesting and exciting. So where are we really? Here is OpenAI's platform called DALL-E. Imagine you are a patent attorney drafting a patent application. You start writing your specification and the diagrams draw themselves. How cool would that be? That's something like what's happening here. We have a system where we provide a text prompt and give me an illustration of a baby chipmunk in a suit, let's say, flying a kite. Look at that. Dozens of AI generated illustrations, all of chipmunks in suits flying kites. How cool is that? That's where we are with AI today. Of course, there are some more serious applications as well. For example, AlphaFold 2. It solves the protein folding problem. So proteins like antibodies and antigens, they all fold in certain ways. And for them to actually be effective in our body, we need to know how they're folding. That has been a very hard problem in biology. And DeepMind, which is a company owned by Google, seems to have solved this problem. So Lex Friedman, a podcaster from whom I stole this slide, he says that the first Nobel Prize for machine learning model might go to AlphaFold 2, which would be a huge landmark. Here's another scenario. Let's say you have a pile of patents sitting with you, and marketing comes and says, we want to make a big splash about these patents. Tell me what's in it. You can't send them the titles and abstracts. That won't work. And you can't tell AI to convert all those patents into marketing speak. What you can do is you can tell the AI to summarize for a second grade student. So here's what we have. The present invention relates generally to the field of somatic cell nuclear transfer, blah, blah, blah. This is an abstract. The AI summarizes it for a second grade student. Says, the invention is a new way to clone animals and get stem cells. Pretty clear, very easy to understand for a second grade student or for the marketing department. So this is where AI is. Here is shameless plug. Our company Dalchera has a patent search engine. So here is our search engine. This is what it can do. Let's say we are asking for patents related to self-driving cars. So we enter the search phrase and say search, and it shows you all these results, like 200,000 plus patent publications. You say show me a taxonomy. So it says, okay, of these, so many patents fall under wireless technology, so many patents fall under navigation, so many patents are related to parking, and so on. This is a taxonomy that's automatically generated. And while doing this search, the system also looked for all these synonyms like robotic car or automotive robotic, etc., etc. All of this was done at the click of a button completely by AI. So that's where the technology is. But how is it being used in the real world? To answer that question and to tell us more about how the future looks for AI in IP department, we have our esteemed panelists today. Sadia Saifuddin from Cisco, Roger Martin from North City West, and John Tinsman from Gadget Jazz. Sadia is at the hub of IP and data information at Cisco. She heads the IP and data analytics function for Cisco. She answers all the questions that inventors, attorneys, executives, everybody has about the sprawling Cisco patent portfolio, which is very, very diverse. Also, she is into the tools and technologies that support the IP function. So she has tried most of the tools in the market that have AI or related capabilities. Roger is an IP strategist extraordinaire. He was at Qualcomm until recently, and during his tenure as the head of IP, as the chief IP officer at Qualcomm, the IP department grew by leaps and bounds. The IP licensing function at Qualcomm, as you all probably know, generates billions of dollars in revenue based on those patents, those standard essential patents that Qualcomm owns. Roger is also a big gadget guy. You know, he has the latest Apple Watch, but also the latest eFoil. And just after this webinar, he's going to be surfing the waves on his eFoil. He heads North City West Consulting, which is an IP strategy consulting firm. John is an engineer's engineer. He has decades of experience with different technologies. He also has been involved in several nine-figure IP licensing and litigation type of exercises, and also in PTAB exercises. If you thought that AI was cool at simplifying things, wait until you listen to John. He's very good at simplifying the most complex concepts. John also heads Gadget Jazz, which is a consulting company specializing in IP licensing and litigation strategy. So what we'll do now is go into a little bit more of the details of what each of our panelists do, and then we will go into some interesting questions and discussions around where IP is with respect to AI and where it's going. I would like to request Sadia to go first and give your a little bit more detailed view of your background and your thoughts on this topic.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining, to the audience, and thanks to Dulcera and IAM for hosting this great panel. So thanks, Samir, for that introduction. I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about myself and my experience with analytics tools, and in particular, what I've seen in the growth of AI. So currently, as Samir said, I'm working at Cisco. We're a large networking company. We have a portfolio of about 20,000 assets worldwide. I've been at Cisco about 3 years now. Initially, I started as an engineer. I worked at Nortel, and then in patents, I worked as an examiner at the Canadian Patent Office. I first started actually looking at patent analytics and assessing patent quality at BlackBerry, where I worked in patent prosecution. And primarily the goal there was to analyze large portfolios to try to assess infringement, determine patent quality. After BlackBerry, I joined an IP consulting firm. It was called Ocean Tomo, and I worked on a variety of strategy, evaluation, analytics, test cases, and engagement engagements. So I was at Ocean Tomo. I first used Anography. That was probably about 8 years ago. It was a more IP specific tool. And then I continued to test various tools in the market. I then worked at General Electric in the licensing group, and so it was a very specific purpose for tool analysis to figure out potential partnership opportunities or licensing. We continued tool analysis. We worked in an arrangement quite similar to how we currently engage with Dolcera, where we had a team of analysts that would basically provide insights into specific requests, and so that's continued as well at Cisco, where we work with the team at Dolcera that uses AI tools. And so now my focus is on prosecution strategy, licensing standards, industry landscapes. So we're excited to discuss some of the AI use cases. And then in terms of outlook, I feel like I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there's been a lot of growth over the years that I've seen the tool development, but as we'll discuss, there are things to be careful about as well.
Thank you, Saria, for this really nice introduction. Roger, would you like to go next?
Sure. As you said in the introduction, I spent a lot of time at Qualcomm. I started as an engineer in like '93. I worked as an engineer for a couple of years and then went into the patent department and worked. We had a couple of hundred patents at the time. I remember the first patent that I worked on was our serial number 187. And of course, over time, over 20 years, you know, Qualcomm's patent portfolio grew from the point where when I was doing patent prosecution, there was less than 1,000 patents. There was a group of people, you know, sort of a core group of people who sort of knew tribally what was in the portfolio. That is, it was possible for one person to kind of understand what all the important patents were and which ones were, you know, were useful for which tasks. But as it grew to 10,000, 20,000 patents, et cetera, and I think at its peak, you know, there's 150,000, you know, patents or something worldwide, there just wasn't a way for people to know. And that's fine as long as people are paying their licensing fees, as long as you're happy with the status quo, as long as there's no problems, there's no real impetus to really understand what's in the portfolio. You invent stuff, it kind of goes in the bucket and everybody's happy. But in about 2006, 2007 timeframe, we started running into some headwinds, you know, with the maturity of the cellular, telephone world. People started to really resist paying patents. We had to try to figure out what we had. And we had tools that were pretty much standard patent databases, right? They had bibliographic data, they had title and abstract and, you know, what date your next maintenance fee was due, but they really didn't have any knowledge, if you would, right? There was no knowledge base about what was in those patents. And about that time, I was asked to sort of take over and create a strategy group. And the question I posed to people was, why is it that I can type into a Google search bar, I want to buy, you know, I want to buy Super Bowl tickets, and I get like 40 results. And I can't, there is no tool where I can type in which of my patents read on Samsung. And I don't, you know, there's no such thing, right? And so figuring out figuring out and capturing in a tool something about how the patents can be used and something about whether they're important and in which ways they help and support your business, that was something we started to set out to do in about 2008. And of course, yeah, it was in its infancy, and we were just trying to figure out, is it even possible to apply advanced sort of advanced learning tools to patents. We had a large portfolio. Most of it was what I referred to as dark matter. That is, each attorney had maybe a handful of patents that they thought was important, and the rest they just, you know, it was like dark matter in the universe. You weren't entirely sure what it was, right, or where it was. And so over time, over many years, we learned some, you know, some fundamental lessons on how to classify that. All of that was really due to the cooperation we had from Dolcera and Samir. You know, you can never underestimate what some clever people can do when faced with some, you know, problems. And we really we tackled that. And today, you know, I've been out of Qualcomm. I retired, you know, 4 years ago. But when I left, we had a really rich knowledge base about, you know, all of our patents. That was a combination of human intelligence and looking at things in a very systematic way, plus all the tools that aided us in making that a more simple problem, making that a more organized problem. So now I run a nonprofit that works on applying AI to prevention of human trafficking. So the lessons we learned at Qualcomm with respect to AI and difficult problems there, I went back to Samir after I retired and I said, hey, there's this problem I really care about, sex trafficking of minors. Can we use, I've got some ideas of ways we could use AI to help prevent that. And so we worked on that, and that turned into some big apps that have actually had a tremendous effect. So that's what we're doing now, and I'm happy to talk more about that or with anybody when it's appropriate.
Thank you, Roger. That's a great introduction, and also, yeah, the human trafficking work that Roger has been working on, and generally his passion for nonprofit or social impact is very, very infectious. I must mention that. John, would you like to give your perspective, please?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I also started out even worse than as an engineer. I started out as a physicist. Even today, I'm a recovering physicist. And my first job was at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. And one day I got a call out of the blue from somebody at the Stanford Intellectual Property Licensing Office. And they said, you know, hey, I got a question. Do you have any patentable ideas? Now, I have to admit to all of you today, I didn't actually know what was the difference between patentable and idea. At that time, I just assumed if it was a great idea, somehow it was patentable. After some education, I learned the difference, and it got me interested in patents. Since then, I've worked largely as an engineer, hardware and software, but at various companies, startup and larger, I've had the opportunity to get involved some way in intellectual property, whether it's standards making, standards essential patents, patent pools, which can be a tough subject, all of that. And it grew my interest in patents. And finally, at my last employer, after running an engineering group for a while, I was drafted into helping a new outbound licensing group. And they said, hey, we need some technical context, much like what Roger described, you know, how do you collect the human intelligence about your own products and correlate that with the portfolio the company had. And I didn't think this was going to be a big deal. And I didn't think it was going to be a big deal to, having collected that intelligence, evaluate the company's portfolio and, you know, decide what was relevant to their own products or competitors, et cetera. And it turned out to be a big deal. It turned out to be such a big deal that it became my full-time job while working for this company. And that's where I ran into Samir and Dulcera, who were already providing some tools to the licensing group. And despite my naivete, I eventually got educated. And, you know, what did I learn? I learned that, just as Roger described, and I'm sure Sadi has run into, you reach a certain size of portfolio where you can't point to any one person, and maybe not even a group of people, who knows what you have. So people are paying money, they're filing continuations, and so on. But if you get asked a specific question, hey, we're launching this new product, what's our coverage on this? It's like, gonna have to look into that. And so just even basically categorizing your portfolio is challenging, right? Even so, Samir shown a taxonomy and Dulcera, even a basic taxonomy like that is a lot of work for a human being to do. And so when you have tools and AI that can do that even at a high level, that's great. The specific problem I was asked to solve, though, was, look, we have a ton of patents. We can't afford, either schedule-wise or money-wise, to look at every one of them in detail. Which one should we look at first, right? Not how hard can that be? Just got to rank them, and, you know, it turns out that's hard too. But again, machine learning and artificial intelligence can be helpful. And in the work that I did, I was lucky because it was around long enough and the project was long enough. We could not only make predictions at the beginning using the tools and people, but also at the end, look at how well we did, both the people, right, and the machine. Because at the end of the day, you look back and say, well, what actually got used in licensing, or what was used to defend a product, or whatever. The people did pretty well, but they weren't perfect. The machine stuff did less well on predicting what the great patents would be. I'll be honest with you. It was okay, but it wasn't great. Where both the people and the machine lined up pretty well is the truly bad patents. And I don't mean bad as in terrible or should never have been granted. I mean bad in the sense that they weren't relevant to the search that was being done and the objectives, that we were trying to achieve. And so what that taught me was, look, even that result is a great result, because what it does is it says I can take this stack of patents and just move them to the side for now and focus on this other stack. And I spent some time quantifying that, and I kind of got hooked on, how can you look at patent portfolio evaluation, and how can you generate metrics and use machines and people to apply those metrics, and ultimately ended up with my own consulting practice, which that's one of the major areas that I concentrate on. Even despite the sometimes lackluster performance of various machine tools and our own processes, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful today because machine learning has gotten better in general, right? And things like Siri and Alexa, you can laugh, and let's face it, when you see whole skits around Alexa understanding or not understanding something on Saturday Night Live, you've actually achieved something, both technologically and culturally. And the technology is getting better. I think people are getting better at using it, but there's a ways to go. And I think hopefully as part of this discussion, we can also talk about not only how it can help, but what you have to be aware of. We were chatting the other day, the group here, and the analogy came up, what's AI like? Well, AI is like a consultant that's been recommended to you that you're having a phone conversation with, right? So you've heard it's good, you've heard it can be helpful, but you still have to wonder, does the person on the other end understand exactly what my problem is? In fact, do I understand what my problem is? Can I really trust them? How do I validate the results? What can I do to make the process better, right? And as part of that, keep in mind that a lot of AI systems only know what you know. They depend on you being able to tell them, this is a good example, this is what I want, this is not what I want. So if you're not clear about what you want and what you don't want, AI is probably not going to help you. It's like the old Yogi Berra joke, right? If you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going to get there. And it's true. At the same time, there's so much data available, and AI is really great at taking large volumes of kind of diffuse data and concentrating it down into a form where if you know what you want, it can help you find it. And so I think with that in mind, and with companies like Cisco or Qualcomm aggressively pushing the state of the art on solving different problems, the industry is going to make forward progress, and the tools are going to get better, and the results are going to get better.
Thank you, John. Yes, so you created a nice segue into sort of what we wanted to discuss next, which is kind of the use cases. You described a couple of use cases already, like how you were able to rank and remove sort of the bad patents very quickly from a large collection. Let's talk about some of the other use cases where AI is being actively used today at your respective companies. So Sadia, would you like to talk about some of those use cases and kind of drill down into the details for us?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Samir. So, so I have a couple of use cases that I've put together. And hopefully this will be helpful for the audience, maybe to give some context in terms of what you could do based on what we've looked into. So the first is search. So what Samir had shown a screenshot of was the patent classification system, which is a Dulcera tool, and there are other tools as well. It's a tool that uses an unsupervised grouping method, and the benefit of the tool is that you can, what we've used it for, and there's other use cases I'm sure, but we've used it to generate technology landscapes and basically define taxonomies related to an area of interest. And so that area can be directed by different business needs. An example, like if I was at BlackBerry, we might be interested in a feature on a phone, for example, and who else is filing in that area. So we would have to direct a query towards that feature. And then another example currently at Cisco would be conferencing. So Cisco has a tool called WebEx, and it's used. It's grown quite a bit, and there are other tools as well in the market that's relevant. So an assessment might be what is the scope of the industry's collaboration and conferencing space. So that's an example of a general area, and then what the tool will help you do is generate a taxonomy, which is sort of a classification system based on keywords, and they use an AI grouping method. So there's a proposal, and this is the way we use it, but we get a proposed taxonomy, which will then vet internally. So Dulcera will produce the taxonomy, send it back to us. We either can review that in the IP group, or we can engage subject matter experts, just depending on where we want to drill down. So for this example, a couple of subtopics might be messaging. So in a lot of tools, you can have a messaging option. It could be the conferencing system. It could be devices or WebEx devices, for example. It could be certain algorithms that might be used, and that might be something we'd want to protect, or we'd want to know what is the industry trending in those areas. Typically, we work with 3 levels of subnodes. So there's an overall level 1, which is probably like 3 to 5 different categories, and then each one of those would be further subdivided into relevant level 2, and then a 3rd level. The 3rd level is usually just for interest, when we actually sort patents into 2 levels, the 1st and 2nd, and that generally provides pretty good insights. And then there's an iterative process. We could refine the topic areas, then we could, once we see the results, we might be satisfied, we might want to look further. Just depends on the nature of what we're trying to achieve with that objective. So that one is a pretty common one. I'd say we use that a fair bit. The second one I'd say is the classification analysis, and I know Dulcera is a separate tool. And just for background, I know there's different ways people could engage with the tool. The way I have had the opportunity to access directly, I actually don't run the tool myself. So I will scope out the problem, and then I work with the team, and there's a project manager, and they will further determine what the parameters are, and then they'll run the results and send it back. So I feel like that's been pretty effective. For the classification tool, there's another, it's a semi-intelligent tool, and then what we use that is to look at dashboards, so we could track progress of any number of companies. It could be 2, it could be us versus another, it could be 2 that we're considering some sort of agreement with, that we want to see what's the status. And to give you an example, so there's two companies I worked at. So Cisco, we report pretty high level, so it's a networking company. We have verticals related to security and applications. Within security, for example, we could have firewalls. Within networking, we could have Wi-Fi. Like, these are very large areas where, like Samir said, Cisco's very diverse patent portfolio. Another example at GE, they had very diverse areas, healthcare, power. So each one of those wouldn't really make sense to classify disparate technology areas. It really makes sense to focus on a particular one, because each one of those have different competitors. And it's quite possible there's another large company that competes in multiple areas, but the way we do it is we focus on one of those areas. And then in order to group them, again, we need access to a tool that can help us do that efficiently. So like John said, you can't reasonably manually sort through thousands of assets. So what the tool does is it aggregates that data according to those categories that we've defined. And then practically how that looks is that there's a set of publication numbers that will generate keywords based on the content of the title, abstract, and claims. It'll group that information, and then there's some review in that, like we do tests, we do sample testing just to make sure that the results are reasonable. And then what we do is we take the results and we aggregate that data, and then we can see, like, for benchmarking, like how 2 companies look relative to another. So we don't have to be exactly on point. We're not getting to the point of some of the other examples of litigation, but what this does is it helps with a snapshot in time, which is informative, and then that's something that we can update periodically.
Thank you. That's super helpful, I think, Sadia, because from a practitioner standpoint, it's always you see these tools in the market. We sell tools, but at the end of the day, it's very hard to figure out how they are actually being used and sort of how the decision making works downstream. So this is a really good insight. Thank you for sharing. Roger, what about your experiences in terms of actually using AI for actual business questions, and how has your experience been?
Yeah, the standard uses for AI, in patents, they're really, well understood uses, right, are search and classification and so forth. Where the money is made, though, is knowing, like, what are your valuable patents. And valuable, of course, depends on context. A patent that's valuable when you're fighting one company might not be valuable when you're fighting a different company, or so forth. But like, the general idea of using AI to narrow the search space or to narrow the considerations or to reveal things that you didn't know were there, in figuring out which are the good ones, right? Everybody kind of wants to know which are the good ones, which are the valuable ones. And that can be as simple as you find one good one and you're like, hey, show me other patents like this. That's a very, standard use case. Show me other patents like this can find prior art. If the patent is, being asserted against you, show me other patents like this can find, other patents in your portfolio that might be useful, if you found one. And then the other really big use case that we used a lot at Qualcomm was taking a large portfolio for potential acquisition and getting to the value in it very, very quickly, right? So obviously you classify it, you kind of, give it a taxonomy and so forth, and kind of do all the sorting, if you would. But then being able to narrow down very quickly where you're likely to find the best stuff. It's not going to tell you what's the most valuable, but it'll tell you where to look for what's the most valuable. Narrow the search space. And so those are the real, I would say, money-making, applications of AI. Is like, tell me which are the good ones. Tell me which are the ones that I need. The rest of the stuff, just sort of the housekeeping associated with patents and the data collection associated with patents, is very good. You should absolutely use AI for that. But when you really need answers quickly and the problem is big, and there's money at stake, that's the exciting uses of AI.
Thank you, Roger. So that sort of dovetails nicely with what John was talking about, which is, you can kind of eliminate the ones that are really off target, and then sort of lets you zero in on the ones that are important, and sort of combined, you can get really useful answers quickly. John, are there other use cases beyond what you already mentioned that you'd like to share? Anything that?
Yes, I think they line up well with what Sadia and Roger said, but again, we're trying to get to the value of a portfolio, yours or somebody else's, whether it's for your products or possibly for litigation. Again, if you're worried about litigation or you're trying to fix a value, you have to really understand a patent in detail and how it's being used. And of course, that's tricky, and it also changes over time, right? Something that wasn't or was valuable 5 years ago may be different now. So you got to apply people, and it might be engineers and it might be lawyers, but they're finite resources. So having intelligent taxonomies to help you narrow down the pile. And if you have a system where you can capture human intelligence alongside whatever the machine generated metrics are and use those for additional analysis, which Dulcera can do, they helped us do that. That's really valuable, because it turns out when we were looking at outbound licensing, unsurprisingly, if you look after the fact, the two most important factors that correlate with the value of a potential patent were, one, is it being used, right? Because if it's not being used, it has zero value. And two, can you tell if it's being used? Because it could be used, but if you have no way of showing that, or for example, getting a Rule 11 basis to do discovery, it really isn't very valuable. And those two things are not things that AI is really good at, basically because it doesn't have the data typically to find it out. But if you have a small enough set of patents, you can ask some engineers or lawyers, depending on the question, say, hey, what do you think of this, knowing what you know about our business or their bit, whatever? Can you give it a rating 1 to 5? And if you fuse that data together and then rerun an analysis with the human and the machine intelligence, so the humans aren't drugged through the drudgery of, really banal stuff like, oh, how old is this patent? And it really improves the process in terms of understanding what you've got or what the other guys have got, and then making better informed decisions.
That's exactly right. If I can add, John, that was really how we approached things at Qualcomm, the combination of the tools and the people. Ultimately, the tools can assist the people in making judgments and narrowing search space and so forth. But one of the great byproducts of having the people capture their judgments, whether it's rating or narrative or whatever whatever's in their mind, I wanted them to put down in some, tool to capture, because that enhances the richness of the data set. Then you can apply tools to, right? All you need is one guy at one time, right, to write down what he thinks this patent is about. And that's additive information that's not already in the patent, it's not already in the public domain, and it's very specific to your business, and it's just free form, whatever it is that he or she thought was important or felt like noting, that becomes stuff that you can build on and build on and build on, right, over time. So the idea of this, the true knowledge base, right, you get ultimately, the idea is you get to the point where you can just type in some natural language search into some box, right, and it returns all of the relevant stuff.
That's a nice segue into kind of what we want to talk about next, which is the future, right? Like, how close are we to that future? Over the last decade or so, companies have invested in AI, have built this sort of, I would say, a nice kind of combined system of using human expertise and using the machine learning tools and technologies. So the machine learning keeps improving, the human information keeps getting added, and we now are beginning to see like really nice, amazing data sets being developed at these large corporations like at Qualcomm and at Cisco and other places. So with that available, with all the new tools that are out, like those large language models that we talked about, how do you see the future playing out? I'd love to hear from you about that. Roger, since you just sort of touched upon it, maybe you can take this one up. What do you see like the future, the next 3 to 5 years of how AI will start impacting IP departments in the upcoming days?
Yeah, there's one problem that's very relevant right now in patents, and that is who owns standard essential patents, right, for 5G. And so everybody's trying to apply AI to that. I actually think that is a tractable problem. It's what turns people off to it is they say, well, the standard language is in sort of a different engineering speak than the patent language, which is kind of in legal speak. But what they miss is there's a bridge in that some human beings have already made decisions about which patents are essential to the standards or which ones to disclose. And so there's your Rosetta Stone that joins those two links. And now you can say, okay, now show me patents like this one, right? And now you've got a set of candidate patents that might be applicable to standards. So I think that's a short-term one. The bigger problems or the more complex problems in patent stuff, I think they're going to take a while longer. There's just not enough motivation. The technology is there. That is, I know from my interaction in searching, my interaction with the web, I know how well existing AI is classifying me as a consumer, right, and suggesting things to me. It's remarkable what it can accomplish that was probably considered heresy 10 years ago. It's just that you need the great scientists and enough capital and enough time to care about a problem to be able to solve it. And so there was enough commercial, motivation for people to solve a lot of these consumer-related problems, like what am I likely to buy? I think there's less, to be able to find patents and so forth, but it'll eventually get there. That is piggybacking on the things that are really commercially, imperative. It'll eventually get there.
Thank you. Sadia, next 3 to 5 years, what does your crystal ball say?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple points. I think the standards one that Roger mentioned, I would definitely agree with that. I think there've been a lot of challenges, and I've seen some improvements in the tool. I don't think they're quite there. I think it's a hard problem. I think the other one that there's a lot of interest in is mapping patents to products, either your own products for freedom to operate or other companies' products for maybe some assistance in infringement. I have seen some tools that will try to upload data sheets and do some mapping, but it's been quite challenging and not very accurate. So I could see that being an area of opportunity. And then what I have seen actually, like, pleasantly surprised by is the improvements in supervised classification systems, where you would train a model and then you apply that to a body of patent, like the entire US patent database, for example, and then you can quickly identify the relevant ones depending on what you define to be relevant. So it could be a feature, it could be a technology area, and that does require a lot of training data. So you have to be able to say what's in or out of a set, but it depends on what you define and a degree of confidence. But I think that has improved, and I think it will continue to improve, which would be very helpful.
Sweet. Thank you, Sadia. John, what are your thoughts on the future, the near future, 3 to 5 years?
Well, I think much along the lines of what Roger and Sadia have said, there's a certain part of motivation to making things better in general. So the new large language models and things like that really reflect the ability for AI to ingest even more data and extract patterns, right? Because if you don't have the relevant stuff in the data, you're not going to get relevant answers out of the data. I used to work in targeted advertising, the bane of everybody who watches streaming television and all of that. And targeted advertisers have been working at it a long time, and they have lots of supervised data. They know what you bought at the cash register, right? They know how many minutes you watch television. And that's rare, and they've taken advantage of it. But I think that data is also available. It might be standards essential patent databases for patents. It could be product data sheets, but there's lots of other data. What about, before we just had litigation in federal district courts in the United States, but today we have thousands and thousands and thousands of PTAB decisions that tell us something about what judges care about and which patents, certain patents show up as anchor patents, as prior art, things like that. So it's out there. I think we're going to be relying on tool vendors to look for more diverse data sources and ingest that and clean it and process it and then incorporate it into their models. And that's going to help everybody make better decisions.
Yes, I think the data pipeline is the real sort of problem area for developing better AI tools, in my opinion. And we are constantly trying to do that, but there are so many barriers as to where we get the data from. Do we have the license to the data, and so on and so forth. So the more data that's available, that's easy. That makes the job easier for us. But that has been a bottleneck, as you pointed out. So what are your worries about AI and IP? Is it going to impact jobs? Is it going to take away our livelihoods? What are your thoughts on that front? John, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure. I think from my own experience in IPRs, there's a certain part of the business that isn't going away, because you can have two teams of very smart people arguing about what exactly one word means. And so if humans can't agree, I don't think machines are going to help that. I think what it's going to, so yeah, I'm not worried about that part of it. In general, what I worry about with a lot of AI tools is as we become more dependent on them, if you look under the hood, a lot of them can tell you what their conclusion is, but they can't explain how they got to it. And for simple answers like, oh, is this a TV patent or is this not a TV patent? Fine. But as we start asking more sophisticated questions, okay, so it's product related. Well, which part of the product? What was the precise piece of documentation that led you to think that it was product? Those kinds of metadata about the decision, those aren't readily available. And if you just look at the answer, you can easily be fooled into perhaps reading more into the conclusion from the machine than you ought to.
Good point. The explainability problem, as they call it in the field. Sadia, your thoughts on sort of what are the pitfalls or areas of concern about AI?
Yeah, so what I would say is just the caution is just to, in terms of relying on the output, I think it's really important to sample the output and see if that's what you'd expect. And if it isn't, then maybe you have to update your process. I don't think that machines will eliminate the need for human interaction. I think patent language is sufficiently difficult that it would not be possible really, but like there's a lot of nuance. But I do think that it would add a level of efficiency and assistance, and especially in terms of large data sets. So I think that the people who actually use the tools, like the skill set will change, but I don't think it'll be replaced.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, I'll just echo what John and Sadia said so eloquently. That is, these tools, they're not magic. They'll give you what you ask it for, and you just have to be very careful about making sure you're asking in the right way, that you understand the problem. That is, you can't solve a problem that you haven't modeled correctly, right? You can't solve a problem that you don't understand, except by accident. And in general, they're just tools. Like a wrench is a tool. There's a whole bunch of different kind of wrenches, right? You know, some closed end, open end, adjustable. They're for different jobs. And I think a lot of people, when they talk about AI, right, they don't understand that there's a whole spectrum of, you know, AI, that some algorithms and some approaches are really great for certain kinds of problems, but really suck at other kinds of problems, right? Give you gibberish. So just having the patience, if you will, right, to work with the tool until such time as you feel like you understand what you're getting and why and how it's applicable. It's never really going to give you an ultimate result, an ultimate judgment, right? It's really never going to give you the answer to the question that you're posing. What it gives you is a lot of shortcuts, right? It points you very close to what the right answer might be, but you still have to make the right decision.
Makes sense. Thank you. And just sort of a similar vein, what is your advice for practitioners, like some do's and don'ts, as you know, as new tools get announced every day, as new sort of best practices evolve? How should a practitioner, a patent attorney, a portfolio manager, how should they approach the use of AI on a day-to-day basis? Roger, how about you?
Yeah, I'll start with it. We already kind of went over some of the don'ts, like don't drink the Kool-Aid. But the do is always, it's competitive advantage for you to be able to do things more efficiently than your competitors, right? And so always be experimenting on that, in the same way that your product groups are doing R&D on, you know, new products and new technologies, new features. You should be doing R&D on new ways to understand what's in your portfolio and to protect, you know, your ideas and so forth. And again, as I said before, never underestimate what a clever group of people can come up with, right? At Qualcomm, we had an in-house team that we called Software Tools Innovation Group, or something to that effect. These guys from Australia who are just extraordinarily clever, right? You just give them a problem and they would go work on it, and they'd come back and you'd be amazed at how well they understood the problem and some, you know, really sort of clever solution to it, right? Same with Dolcera, right? We had this external team, which was Dolcera. I would sit down with Samir and I'd say, okay, here's my vision. Can you make me a tool that does X? And you know, clever people will sit and they will go away, and you keep doing whatever you're doing, running your IP business, right? Doing your licensing and so forth. And those clever people will come up with answers. Never stop doing that. So that's a do, because if you don't do that, you're going to be outcompeted in the patent space by your competitors, and over time, that's going to hurt your company.
Thank you, Roger. John, your do's and don'ts for patent practitioners?
Again, I touched on some of the don'ts, and I don't want to sound too negative. You know, always have to take the results with a grain of salt. I would say for a do, when you go through an exercise, portfolio evaluation, whatever, you should treat it like an experiment. So you should have a plan before you do it. You should document what you did, even if you made some adjustments. And don't just keep the answers around, because sometimes the process by which you got to the answers is more informative or valuable later on if you have to do it again. So like if you're tracking your products and your competitors' products, whatever your process is, even if it's a little flawed, just make sure that you can do it consistently, because if you don't, you can't compare answers over time or, you know, across space or anything, and then it becomes a lot less valuable. So yeah, you know, treat it as an experiment, document what you do, and then of course cross-check the results.
Thank you, John. Sadia, your do's and don'ts for patent practitioners when it comes to using AI.
Yeah, mine are very similar. I would just say just define the goals for what you're trying to do and understand the limitations of the tools that you're using and the process and all of that. I completely agree with.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for all your wonderful advice and thoughts and directions for this industry. We will open up the floor for questions. You know, you can ask your questions in the questions box that we have provided here. please let us know what's on your mind. We will address these questions for the we'll translate these questions for the panel, and we'll get them answered. We still have about 7 or 8 more minutes, so please type away.
What we'll do just in the meantime is we do have some poll questions. So I am just going to launch those questions shortly. But in the meantime, please do send those questions in, just like Samir said. I will just launch a few questions. Please do take the time to answer those.
Okay. Thank you, Lucy.
Click on Roger's talk. That's the answer.
Yes. These are interesting questions. I had nothing to do with them. I must. Yes, Raji, you got your
popularity contest. Popularity poll. And we all know who won.
There you go. AI or machine learning, yes. Okay. Okay, in the meantime, here's a question that I just received. How do you explain the benefits of AI-based projects to the internal stakeholders? Maybe Sadia, would you like to take this one on? How do you kind of translate these for the internal stakeholders?
Yeah, so just practically in terms of the way we do it, we don't necessarily disclose the tool set that was used. We usually take a business question, and then internally in the analysis team, we'll figure out what's the best use of tools. So for my experience, I don't feel like I really need to sell it. I just have to evaluate to see if AI would be the best suited for a particular purpose.
Right. Okay. Any thoughts on this question, Roger or John? How do you explain the kind of benefits to the stakeholders if it ever comes up in the discussions or anything like that?
Yeah, from my standpoint, I was fortunate to work at a company that really valued innovation. Generally, the culture was innovation. So the idea of innovating around patent analytics and patent decision making seemed very natural. And so I really didn't have to sell, as much. As long as I stayed within my budget, they were happy to hear that I was doing, creative things and working with creative people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question, this Roger, if you can take this one on. As a chief IP counsel, what kind of budgets do you allocate for AI type processes, and how expensive does it get? I guess it's a question of, does it really, save me money, or does it cost money upfront? Like, how does it work? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I wish I could remember. It's sorry that I'm going to give you a dud answer on that, Samir. It's just been long enough that I looked at budgets to I can't remember how I viewed, tools in the budget.
Sadia, any thoughts on sort of the budget allocations? How do you think about these tools and processes?
In terms of budget, I mean, we do have fixed budgets, so we have to, kind of balance what the business priorities are with what we're spending. But I think for good tools, it's definitely worth investing in, or good services. I do think there's a lot in the market, and again, it comes back to the business question, like what you're trying to answer and what would best help you reach that answer.
So that brings me to another question. How do you do this evaluation? Like, do you do a bake-off? Do you kind of like define problem sets and give it to different tools or vendors? How do you do that kind of evaluation internally, or what kind of best practices would you recommend?
Yeah, so for me, when I started, I think there was some analysis that was happening, but I feel like we've grown the function quite a bit. So initially, we didn't have very much in terms of a regular cadence. So I think working with Dulcera, subscribing to some tools that we would use, we basically evaluate what the questions we're trying to answer. And then for new questions, once we have an established practice, we'll figure out if we have the tool set to analyze that. If we don't, then we'll look to see what different providers are. So it's really important, I think, to keep up on what tools are available in the market. And so that's when you learn about what the progress is. So you might see a tool demonstrated today that you saw 5 years ago, and there's been big changes. And then you'd evaluate whether that difference is going to benefit the questions you're trying to answer. And it's not just tools. I mean, we do work with other consulting firms that might address different types of problems, market research, financial. It just depends on what sort of roster you would need. And I don't feel like you need multiple vendors that do the same thing, but if there's a incremental benefit, then you'd evaluate that, and then you'd see whether it's worth signing on to another one.
Makes sense. The last question, since we are almost out of time, how far are we from a world without patent attorneys, with AI doing all the work? Just
Far.
Far. Okay. Roger?
Yes, sadly, us patent attorneys are going to be around for a while. Again, that in order to, you need somebody to turn the wrench. The wrench will never turn itself, and the wrench will never decide which nuts it needs to tighten and which nuts it needs to loosen.
Sadia, last word. How far are we from that word?
Oh, without patent attorney, yeah, I don't see it. Like, not at all. Like, not in terms of like replacing. I think it's definitely an important skill set we will continue to need.
Great. Well, on that optimistic and positive note, we will end today's presentation. Thank you very much to the panelists, Sadia, Roger, and John. You were amazing. I hope the attendees got a good flavor of how this field is progressing, where we are headed. Thank you, Lucy, for and IAM for organizing this webinar. I really appreciate the opportunity. And if you have any questions, please reach out to us, and we can also connect you to the panelists if you have any questions for the panelists as well. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.